Yesterday, President Donald Trump provided strong and decisive leadership to restore the trust and confidence of the American people in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm grateful for the action the President has taken, and I'm confident as we go forward that the President will choose an individual who will be able to restore the confidence of our nation in our leading law enforcement agency. President Trump made the right decision at the right time, and to accept the recommendation of the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General to ask for the termination, to support the termination of the Director of the FBI was simply the right decision. But now we go forward. We go forward with confidence that the President, as he's done so many times in this administration, he'll select that individual who will be able to lead that agency and all the outstanding men and women of the FBI back to a place where that agency can enjoy the confidence of the American people.
But did the President fire Director Comey to impede the Russia investigation?
Well, as you know very clearly, as has been stated repeatedly and the President has been told, he's not under investigation. And as former Director Clapper of the Director of National Intelligence said, there is no evidence of collusion between our campaign and any Russian officials. That's not what. But let me be clear with you. That was not what this is about. That's not what this is about. The President took strong and decisive leadership here to put the safety and security of the American people first by accepting the recommendation of the Deputy Attorney General to remove Director Comey as the head of the FBI. The American people have to have confidence in the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And because of the actions that the Deputy Attorney General outlined to the President that were endorsed and agreed with by the Attorney General, the President made the right decision at the right time. And now we look forward to finding that individual who will be able to lead that agency and all the outstanding men and women of the FBI back to a place where we move past the difficult politics of the last year that have swirled around Director Comey's leadership, and we can move back to a place where every American can know that the FBI is able to do its job to enforce our laws and protect our nation.
Thank you, everyone. What about the President's dissatisfaction with the Russia probe? Did that play into this, sir? And
let me be very clear that the President's decision to accept the recommendation of the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General to remove Director Comey as the head of the FBI was based solely and exclusively on his commitment to the best interest of the American people and to ensuring that the FBI has the trust and confidence of the people of this nation. The President's leadership here, I think, represents the kind of strong leadership that the American people expect. That the American people expect a president to act on the recommendations of those within the administration who are charged with oversight. In this case, the Deputy Attorney General provides the oversight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. While the Deputy Attorney General was confirmed just a few short weeks ago by the United States Senate, when he brought the recommendation to the President that the Director of the FBI should be removed, President Trump provided the kind of strong and decisive leadership the American people have come to be accustomed from him. And he took the action necessary to remove Director Comey. And now, already this morning, the President is in the process of evaluating individuals who will be able to fill that spot, lead the FBI, and restore the confidence of the American people. That's why this was the right decision at the right time.
Given the bipartisan kind of concern we've seen over the last 24 hours and the administration's assertion that there was no wrongdoing, why not support an independent panel or an independent prosecutor?
The evidence or the facts that are in public today are very clear. The former Director of National Intelligence has said there is no evidence of collusion. The President and I remain confident that the committees in the House and the Senate that are looking into every aspect of issues that arise out of last year's election will be able to do their work and do it in an orderly way. The President himself was informed several times by the former director of the FBI that he himself was not under investigation. But the simple fact is, Director Comey had lost the confidence of the American people. The support that I heard from members of the Senate today, when I was over by the Senate chamber, the support for the President's decision that's being expressed in this Capitol building and around the country, I think is reflective of the fact it was time for a fresh start at the FBI. And I think the President did as he's done in so many other cases. He took decisive action. He provided strong leadership to act on the recommendation of the Deputy Attorney General. And I think the American people welcome that, and they know that as President Trump has done so many times before, the President is going to take the time necessary to find an individual of great experience and great integrity to lead the nation's law enforcement agency at the FBI, and I look forward to being a part of that process.
Mr. Vice President, did the President ask the Deputy Attorney General to conduct a review of Director Comey?
The new Deputy Attorney General, who was just sworn in 2 weeks ago and confirmed by the FBI, came to work. He is a man of extraordinary independence and integrity and a reputation in both political parties of great character. Came to work, sat down, and made the recommendation that for the FBI to be able to do its job, that it would need new leadership. He brought that recommendation to the President. The Attorney General concurred with that recommendation. And I personally am grateful that we have a President who's willing to provide the kind of decisive and strong leadership to take the recommendation of the Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General to remove an FBI director who had lost the confidence of the American people. That being said, let me be very clear. We have some great men and women who serve in the Federal Bureau of Investigation every day, who make enormous sacrifices for the people of this country. And I'm very confident that the President will go through a process and he will choose an individual who will be able to lead the FBI, not only back to credibility, to restore the trust and confidence of the American people, but lead the FBI to even greater heights to ensure that it does its job enforcing our laws and protecting our country.
Sir, when did you become aware that the Deputy Attorney General was conducting a review?